Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome, a big welcome to you all to the first of this year's Our Changing World lectures. Before we enjoy the first of these lectures, I just want to explain to newcomers to this what the series is. It's a series of lectures that given by people in the university, and the doors are open to absolutely anybody, so it's a way of the university sharing what we do. And it's also a way, because there's a discussion session afterwards, of the university listening to your views and opinions and ideas. So it's a sort of two-way discussion. As well as being a series of public lectures, it can also be taken by our undergraduate first-year students if they want to as a course. So they can attend just as everybody attends, or they can attend to take this as a course. And if they choose to do it as a course, they have tutorials which are guided discussions around the topics raised by each of these talks. So we have both sorts of people here, students taking this as a course and people here being interested but not having to do the tutorials. If you are a student, sorry for this very administrative notice, but could you please make sure you've done the electronic registration, because if you haven't, a big electronic finger will come and wag at you, I'm told. So please make sure you've done that. Our topic for Our Changing World this year is identity. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, all of whom are talking about different aspects of identity. And sometimes the connection between what they're talking about and that word will be very obvious, and sometimes it'll be a little bit left field, but that's the idea, because identity is a very broad concept that can be applied to many things. It's my huge pleasure this evening to introduce Lynn Jamieson, who is Professor of Sociology, Families and Relationships at this university. She's been part of the Edinburgh world for a long time, and she did her master's and her doctorate here at this university. And she's a founding co-director of the university's Centre for Research on Families and Relationships, which tells you a lot about her research interest. She's published many research articles and chapters in this area of sociology of families, relationships and growing up, and also in some other areas as well. She's a collaborator in the Growing Up Scotland project, which is a longitudinal study on the experiences of young people entering their 20s and that sort of age and then growing through. And her work has been recognised by the fact that she was elected to serve as president of the British Sociological Association. So I'm absolutely delighted that Lynn was willing to give one of these lectures. I'm very much looking forward to hearing it. Please join me in welcoming her.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me. And because this is about identity, I can say with confidence that you may be anybody, but you're also certainly somebody, all of us. So I'm going to ask if anyone in the room could guess why I might be showing a picture of a large volcano. Anyone want to hazard a guess? And actually, this is also by way of saying, feel free to shout. I know it's always difficult in these big lectures, but if you do ever feel moved to shout something at me, that's okay, actually, that you can do that. And I will sometimes ask you questions. I know it's very difficult to give answers, so I kind of half don't expect one, but I'll be delighted if I do get one, okay? So I'll maybe come back in the absence of you shouting anything at me to the... Sorry? Yes, exactly so. I knew you knew. I knew Smarty Pants David Somerville knew. Anyway, no. We will come back to that as well. Okay, so this is the aim of the lecture. Or aims. I want to introduce some sociological and social scientific understandings of the connections between identities, personal lives, and issues of inequality and unsustainability, and talk about this in the context of a globalised world. And I hope to demonstrate really how interpersonal relationships of personal life, both intentionally and often unintentionally, shape identities and at the same time wider social worlds. and to note some grounds for optimism as well as very real extreme concern about the intersections of identity, personal lives, and inequality and unsustainability. So those are the aims. And I've got this set of double-headed arrows with personal life in the middle, showing how I think personal life is situated between identity and, I'm calling it world making, the business of how the world is shaped. And the first two themes on the overhead and the two questions underneath are, I guess, in a loose sense, the structuring of the lecture. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to tell a whole story. I'm not going to offer solutions, but I'm hoping that there'll be something that will be of interest that you can work with in your own way, and that you'll carry on a conversation about this afterwards, maybe. So I won't fully answer the questions about the conditions that enable personal life to support kindness and community, or to be a site of political energy and to give us the capacity for collective action. But I'll touch on these things, and I hope to persuade you that even if I can't illustrate all the evidence and muster it in a fantastic manner, that actually personal life can do that. It can do both of these things. So I'm starting with these diagrams that I've got two diagrams. Both of them are imperfect illustrations of how I understand this interaction between identity, personal life, and the world. This one is showing them interacting, but it treats them as separate entities, whereas in fact they are much more mutually embedded. And this other diagram shows them as embedded, encompassing, but it doesn't really have the active element. But I think maybe, nevertheless, showing some kind of graphical illustration might just help us get started in thinking about this. And then this image with this all sorts of other funny blobs on it is also showing that, you know, there's other things going on. I'm not trying to talk about everything that there is. Okay, so defining key terms is something that academics often do. We use language sometimes in rather specialized ways, and we try to be clear about how we're using it. And I'm not going to labor over all of the words in my title because I don't have time, but identity obviously is, given that this whole series is about identity, it would maybe be a bit remiss of me not to try to define that at least a bit and to talk about it, how I'm using it. So I'm starting with two different theorists, a psychologist and a sociologist, and what they are saying about the relationship between identity and environment, our world, if you like, our wider social world, and trying to sort of start from there. So we know that animals are adapted to their natural world environment, and they at the same time modify it. So if you're a sheep or a deer, you eat grass, you graze, and intensive grazing means no trees will grow. So in Scotland, when we chop down the trees and then we've got lots of deer, we don't get new trees unless we build fences. Our social and our natural world as humans are our environment or our habitat. And I would argue, as a sociologist, and particularly a sociologist of families and relationships, that the emotionally charged interpersonal relationships, especially of our early years, but throughout our whole life course, they play a very large part in shaping who we are, but they also are playing a large part in shaping our whole social world. So as humans, Pierre Bourdieu talked about how we have a kind of habitat and a habitus. Our habitus is the embodied dispositions that we come to take on, that become us, become who we are, become what we think and feel about things as we occupy our habitat. And Gibson talked about how the environment has an affordance, so we can become different kinds of people in different kinds of environments. The two are interconnected, but it's not just a passive, here we are shaped by our environment. At the same time, we are doing shaping of it. It's a mutual process. But that also starts to give you some sense of why inequality is immediately an issue. I mean, we're not all born into the same kinds of affordances. We don't all have the same opportunities to be all kinds of people because of the context that we inhabit. So there's lots of people have said this at different historical periods and in different ways. And some of the characters that are seen as the founders of sociology, my discipline, have talked about this. So here we have Karl Marx talking about how we are born into a pre-existing world, but it's not one of our making. Of course we're born into a pre-existing world, but also Karl Marx was talking about social class differences and advocating collective action to overcome inequalities and unequal situations that people were born into. More recently, we have the sociologist C. Wright Mills, who we continue to teach, talking about the interlocking of biographies and histories. So we don't make our history in circumstances of our choosing. But nevertheless, we do have capacities to innovate and to break with tradition. But some people are in positions that make that easier than others. So it doesn't always feel like we can make history. Some people, and in a globalised world of mass media where we've got loads of glimpses of other people's lives, some people are very aware that they are trapped in their situation, that they have fewer opportunities and feel like they are reproducing their own inequality with nowhere else to go, no other way. So this would be an example of such a situation. So this is a family in India where rain is always a problem because of the inadequacy of their dwelling, and there's times of the year where their children have to be sent to live with other kin. But an exceptional rainfall, a flood, is catastrophic because they are forced to take on debt. There is no safety net. There is no other either informal system or formal system that could offer them what they needed other than the moneylender. And now they are totally enmeshed in circumstances that they can't escape. So I'm now wanting to show some images that illustrate affordance, if you like, in different circumstances and environments. So this is the stereotypical suburban family home. And this particular image is from the catalogue that lots of people in Edinburgh use when they're trying to buy a house, and it's a picture of a house in Dalgety Bay. And the caption describes it as an ideal family home with garden. I don't know, does anything else strike you about the image? Anybody want to shout anything? What was that?
The presence of the burglar alarms.
Burglar alarms, yes. I hadn't particularly spotted that, but you're right. What it draws my eye to, actually, is this paved area in the front, and the garage. So it seems to me like the car is as important, even although there isn't one there. Somehow it's as catered for as the humans in the way that I see the house. But yes, you're right. The burglar alarm is maybe telling us also something. Now this, in contrast, is the kind of house, informal settlement, that far more people live in, that is the majority world. And I use the term majority world, meaning the world that isn't the minority-rich world, the world in which most people live. It's not my term. It comes from colleagues in anthropology and childhood studies, and particularly maybe Sam Punch at the University of Stirling. So the final sort of inequalities at a global level slide I want to show is this one of carbon footprints. So I've just taken a kind of random selection of countries. It shows you from the highest to pretty well the lowest. And so a carbon is measured here in terms of the burning of solid or liquid fuels and the making of cement and the flaring of fuels. So in terms of per head, this is per head of population, Qatar has the highest. So the oil-producing, high-consuming Arab state. And you see then Australia and the United States are pretty even Stevens. Then Europe, China has now overtaken the UK only just. We get down to Ethiopia, which is like Eritrea, basically kind of off the scale. So there's incredible inequalities. And the point of the diagram really is that the harms of climate change, so the burning of fossil fuels is what's causing climate change, but the harms are disproportionately falling on the least advantaged. So like the family from India. So it's one of the ironies of our century is that the richer we are, the larger our carbon footprint tends to be. And the larger our carbon footprint, the more our contribution to global warming. But the extreme weather events and the other kinds of harms tend to fall disproportionately, both within any country on poorer people, but on the global scale on the poorer countries of the world. So I'm going to switch from that to talking about middle-class white families in the United Kingdom. And I'm talking about inequality now, providing different affordances in personal lives that affect identities through the specific example of a study of parenting. This is a qualitative study conducted in the early 2000s. It was a survey followed up by a small interview study, 25 mothers, 11 fathers, 27 households, different socioeconomic backgrounds. Now here's middle-class parents talking about Joel as very bright, attractive, academic. Joel's parents are sufficiently rich in all kinds of ways, not just economically, but also in their social connections and in their cultural knowledge, to be able to enhance Joel's advantages. They can afford to work part-time in order to prioritize time with him. Their own education makes it possible to monitor what's happening in school in quite sophisticated ways, to negotiate on his behalf with teachers, to engage with his homework in ways that are to his benefit, but still remain pleasurable without making him feel too supervised. This comment about worry about physically very skilled but academically backward doesn't make any explicit reference to social class, but there's an acknowledgement maybe of some sort of association between less bright and bullying, and also maybe of the advantages, a suggestion of the advantages of early streaming. So in contrast to that, Liam's working class parents, rather than stressing his exceptionality, stress him fitting in, being enthusiastic, willing to learn, not kicking off all of the time, just some of the time, and being prepared to fit in. So they've got different tones in terms of how they speak about their child, and very different advantages. So Liam's parents wouldn't have the confidence to monitor the school, to intervene. They themselves are working very long hours for low wages, and can't always be there in person for Liam. So, but maybe they're giving, in terms of the identity of the child, a different sense of privilege, entitlement, and who they are and what they can be themselves. But not because that's what they're seeking to do, but because of, of the habitat and their habitus. So children have a whole network of care, of course. It's not usually just parents. You will know, if you're parents, that you couldn't shape the child any way you wished. Ourselves are made not completely in childhood. That's never the end of it. We remain relationally attuned throughout our lives, and there are many other influences than parents, and peer groups are also very powerful support networks and influences, and particularly friendship relationships. But then there's the cultural backdrop of all kinds of messages that we, especially in this globalised world, that I'm going to talk more about here. But selves are definitely developed in relationships. So as sociologists, that's how we would stress this. And we would draw on social psychology and talk about how, as humans, we learn to see ourselves as others see us to some extent. Some of us are better at that than others, but to some extent we all have a capacity to be attuned to how other people see us. And a sense of a kind of generalised other, the voices of a wider community, of the totality of everything you've learned about what other people would see as the appropriate thing for you to do. And we have a kind of internal dialogue with ourselves that mirrors our experience, early experience, developing experience about how people react to us. So despite the uniqueness of who we are, because of the unique constellation of life that we have around us and our habitat, we also have these things in common. Our sense of what am I, who am I, is one of continuity, but at the same time we also have many identities as we take on different roles and different positions. And in all of those different roles, we have some capacity to think about how other people are seeing us. Okay, so now I want to just briefly talk about globalised. The phrase globalised is a bit preposterous in some senses. We've always had a global world that's been round and global, and ecologists have always understood its interconnectivity. But we're much now more aware of that, especially because of climate change. But also, the concept globalised is more specific. So you maybe know this thing about butterfly wings in one part of the world causing a hurricane in another. But globalised also, the way we use it as sociologists, is talking about flows of people, goods, information, ideas, and it's a new sense of, a different kind of sense of connectivity, one where national boundaries, nation states don't feel like containers to the same extent. There is always something beyond, always an interconnectivity. And so but at the same time, that is reflecting inequalities. So the image of the passport reminds us of that. Not everybody has equal freedom to take advantages of the advances that have been and are shown in this slide in terms of mobility and movement of people and goods around the world. And arguably, actually, also, some of this, although these technologies are very new, you have to remember that in the 19th century, literally millions of people moved from Europe to the United States, many of them without passports. So some of it is also, like, our sense of newness sometimes gets out of proportion. But the sort of idea of diffusion of ideas across the globe and the possibility that we're moving towards a global culture and a global society, and that in terms of the kinds of people we are, we might start to become more similar. That view has been around for some time, and there are different proponents of those kinds of ideas, some very pessimistic, as if we were all going to become very crude, selfish, individualized, commercialized people, or some much more optimistic. So John Mayer here is talking about an optimistic version of this. He talks about the universal human rights, the dominance across all cultures of science and rational science, acceptance of professional experts whose evidence is based on scientific knowledge, so that as if a kind of more generalized other that is based on evidence and knowledge might be a possibility for us as a human species. But he places a lot of emphasis on individual human rights to choose or unchoose family, religion, nation, and so on. And more cynical readings of this would talk about the hegemony of a particular Western neoliberal ideology and so on. So there's debates about all of this. And meanwhile, there are theorists like Gordon Thorburn arguing that there's still persistent, very persistent, long-standing, locally situated differences in parts of the world that he doesn't see as going away. But the idea that personal life itself is modified by the diffusion of ideas about love, intimacy, equality, is also very much around in the literature and debated. And this example is based on survey evidence showing very radical change in what people say about the rights and wrongs of intimate partner violence in Nigeria in a relatively short period of time, and arguing that this can only really be cultural diffusion. And I would argue that actually the practical way of taking up ideas like this depends also on what's happening in people's personal lives. So the media discourse about domestic violence that has had a global reach, like the Me Too hashtag campaign, undoubtedly has an impact. But there's a long line of research on media, from David Morley's work on television onwards, that shows how we're not passive recipients of media messages. We work with them, and how we work with them depends on what others are saying about them, that we value the opinion of, people that we are feeling emotionally close to, and how they fit with the practicalities of the lives that we live. So another optimistic versions that are in tune in some ways with the Mayer argument are here shown. Norbert Elias talking about European identity and a sense of global citizenship gradually becoming more part of people's consciousness as institutions that have a reach beyond nation states develop. And sociologist Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, talking about how actually personal relationships across borders can start to broaden people's horizons, and that the more intermarriage, the more transnational families, the more mobility there is, so that people have in social networks people from different parts of the world, the more likely we are to be thinking in terms of sympathy with humans as a species, rather than our own nation, our own context, our own boundaries. And I think the evidence is between the two, so it needs the combination. So European identity, for example, obviously this is written before Brexit, but European identity is strongest among those who both have an idea of some common cause with Europe and practical experience of productive, effective, emotionally rewarding relationships across national boundaries. So slogans around what is our own, who we are, and how we should be represented, often are making appeal to a personal life where people make boundaries. What people mean by our own, how welcoming they are to others, begins at home, and with sufficient means to be hospitable in families, in friendships, and in personal relationships. But it's also more or less supported by political culture. So we have had a political culture in the British context that has been very hostile to migrants and in many senses very unwelcoming. It's also supported by local civic and public institutions that make it possible for people to have pleasant, orderly space for meeting other people and for social mixing, and that support intergenerational and peer relationships and social mixing. So different contexts afford very different kinds of opportunity for border crossing, mixing, openness, hospitality. And if you're feeling pessimistic about Brexit and thinking with the rise of populist parties and so on that everything is going in a very bad direction, remember that it's minorities. Remember that it was possible in Sweden to stand up as a politician and ask people to take refugees and migrants into their heart, and to take in a disproportionate number of migrants, even if there was a minority backlash. So talking and not talking politics is part of also people's family practice. So during the referendum campaign here in Scotland, both things went on. There were more intensive speaking politics than ever before for many people, and some had to tune out and some had to go back and agree not to speak politics. But families can be a site of first learning to think about and talk about politics, as indeed often are friendship relationships. An intergenerational dialogue about environmental issues often can go in either direction. So here in this slide there's a couple of examples of pieces of research in which there's some instances of younger people modifying their parents' behaviour. One from research on vegetarianism and veganism, and one on a kind of counter-reaction to that. So a mother feeling affronted, but in a sense, by her daughter trying to morally upstage her, and being told that car driving is the new smoking. So these kinds of dialogues do go on in some family households. Okay, so finally we get to sustainability. this is the standard definition of sustainable development. It's one that some people might be familiar with. The meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But unfortunately, we're not living in a world of sustainable development, but in what some people have called the Anthropocene age, in which we're causing the mass extinction of the rest of the species on the planet and ultimately our own. Now, as I've already indicated, the burdens of harm are falling equally. A coalition of organisations in Britain, including organisations like the RSPB, Environmental Protection Organisations, produces a State of the Nature report and shows that 40% of species are in serious decline, more than half of species in the UK are in decline. Every year, hundreds become extinct. And people who advocate for non-human species, of course, often have in their biographies a significant other who paid particular attention to the natural world, and their interest in it facilitated practices such as learning the names of wildflowers, of birds, of bird watching, and things like that, so that they then went on to become people like the David Attenboroughs of the world. But for most of us, we can hardly name any species, and this is one area in which intergenerational transmission has increasingly failed, and that we're not doing well. The scientific rationality that Mayer talks about hasn't protected us from destroying our planet. And sociologists have tried to understand the dynamic of what locks us into very high carbon practices. John Arry here notes, especially important are the interlocking carbon interests, the carbon military industrial complex. And he talks about this as a kind of class politics that's locking together national grids, steel and petroleum car systems, suburban housing filled with consumption goods, technologies for networking at a distance, aerial mobility, travelling by aeroplane. And he notes that it's not individuals who have to change, but the social and physical systems that we are locked into. But this doesn't mean, actually, that I would agree, even although I'm quite sympathetic, I'm sympathetic with what John Arry says, doesn't mean I would agree with this perspective, which comes from interviews with parents in India and in the United Kingdom about how, well, it's got to start at the top. Of course, starting at the top is how to, in some senses, change the kind of systems that John Arry was talking about. But actually, we know perfectly well that politicians respond to what they believe their electorate want, and that it's not actually that simple. And constellations of personal relationships, the constellation of people we move with throughout our life, our nearest, our dearest, are a system. And they are a system that can give energy to collective action, that can foster alternatives to the carbon military industrial complex and innovate. And our identities can be more or less predicated on being a high consumption person. Now, of course, at the moment, there's plenty of evidence about the ways in which domestic life is locked into high carbon systems and how practices of family life and friendship are part of high carbon lifestyles. So this image of a child's bedroom taken from the BBC in their schools programme, trying to represent what childhood looked like in the First World War, I know from oral history research, is actually an incredibly privileged 1914 family bedroom, and actually it would be much barer and you would have multiple occupancy in the bed and the room for many households. If you think about what a family bedroom for a child looks like now, and think about how much stuff there is, how rapidly that is very, very different. That's part of what I'm talking about. Our energy consumption in family homes is the major use of gas in this country. We are also significant users of electricity in our family home. And the electric shower is a classic example of how personal lives are locked into high carbon practice that Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues have talked about. And Shove made a significant contribution to how we theorise practices and how we get locked into them and how they might change, talking about the way that what things mean to us, the competencies we start to take for granted and our material context all get interlocked. So the comfort, convenience and cleanliness offered by the shower suddenly starts to become our standard way of talking about being clean. Have you showered today? It's the thing that has the highest single electricity use of gadgets in the home. And the daily shower is significantly added to our carbon footprint. The family meal might be another example of how things have changed. Its demise has been very overstated. We do still try to sit down together as a family in most households, maybe not every day, but at least several times a week. But what we eat, how we cook it, has changed very significantly, but also what we throw away. And household waste in this country is a very significant issue in terms of its carbon footprint. And then, of course, there's the car sitting outside the house. Now, there's a car for every single household and a bit more. But, of course, every house doesn't have a car. Actually, the proportion of households with no car is about the same as the proportion of households with more than one. So again, there's a great deal of inequality in this issue. But for those who do have the car, and especially for dual earner households bringing up children, the car has become a standard means for coordinating time schedules and locations. It's also a site of being and doing and displaying family, a kind of a mobile home from home. A private domestic space, and the taken for granted practice of driving is passed on in family households. And people justify their car use even when they say they don't need it. And as Ari noted, it's locked into the stereotypical suburban family home. So here is a middle-class mother talking about how it's a shame that they've got to have a four-wheel drive, but the school is wonderful for the children. And meanwhile, of course, the person with the four-wheel drive is driving past other children's schools, other housing estates on her way to work and adding to the pollution that's causing asthmas and so on. But yet there are other scripts out there. So there are also family practices where people are consciously trying to be more environmental and maybe acknowledging that's not the only reason why they're doing things differently. But here we have somebody talking about how an urban context, rather than the suburban ideal family home, is what they chose. And part of why they chose it is because they know that it's more sustainable. It may not be the only reason, but they're very aware of all of the ways in which it involves less car use and can be a more sustainable existence. Okay, so I've just scratched the surface of some issues, really. Now, there's opposing positions in each of these sorts of discussions that I've been referring to. I've only been able to offer a smattering of some research by way of hopefully whetting your appetite for exploring further. It's not been a systematic review of evidence, but I hope that I have illustrated that personal life is implicated in shaping identities and in shaping wider social worlds, and indeed the natural world. So, of course, everything that we call natural, certainly in the United Kingdom, is usually in many ways managed. Now, I think that there is overwhelming evidence that personal life is implicated in these ways. But the doubt is about the optimism versus the pessimism, and the potential for personal life to be part of the solution of climate change rather than part of the problem. So climate justice is often taken to mean the polluter should pay. So the harms of excessive consumption and carbon emissions, the persons making those harms should pay. But of course the opposite in fact occurs. And much of our domestic consumption in this country is taken for granted high carbon practice that isn't attending to the needs of the future or to distant people in poorer countries that are suffering because of our excess. And within the rich world, it is the case that the least well off, who've got a sense of making do and getting by, have got the lowest carbon footprint, and yet are not celebrated for that, cannot celebrate that, rather are seen as missing out, experience it as missing out. And those who do deliberately choose a very low carbon lifestyle are still sometimes treated as lunatic, fringe, and a threat. Some people who are trying to gain moral high ground and put everyone else down, rather than being embraced, because normal continues to mean denial and underplaying the problem. But yet, the optimistic part is that there's absolutely ample evidence that we, despite the commercialization that I've not really been able or had time to talk about, and the globalization in terms of, distancing media and constant barrage of media messages, despite all of that, we are generally willing to be kind and generous to each other. And there is plenty of personal life to build on in terms of being generous and kind to strangers. So if that is facilitated by the affordance of an environment that enables personal life and relationships to flourish, that does provide a sort of safety net and a decent backdrop of support, and decent public space, public transport, civic institutions, perhaps also free Wi-Fi hotspots and friendly, publicly moderated and curated internet sites, as well as places of face-to-face meeting. If we have infrastructures that support if you like, natural, sociologists don't often use that word, but our human propensity to be attuned to each other, to want to please each other, and our, in friendship and families, still continued commitment to caring for each other. If we have infrastructures that support those things, then collaboration across generations and collective action for the common good remains very much on the agenda, and the possibility of narrowing this I-we boundary still is far more likely than a kind of retreat into self-centred individualism. Okay, and I think that's where I want to stop.